Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of No Script, No Problem on Believe, the #1 podcast network for professionals. I am your host, Steve Berkowitz, and today I'm talking to the incredibly talented Malaika Vaz. She is a National Geographic Explorer, a wildlife filmmaker, a TV host, and she's the co-founder and CEO of Untamed Planet, a production company focused on environmental documentaries and unscripted series. Malaika is not even 30 years old yet, and she's already producing content across some of the most hostile terrain on all 7 continents, including hiking across glaciers in the Antarctic, filming undercover with criminal syndicates, and diving with tiger sharks. Here is Malaika speaking at the Synapse Conclave Conference.
I've realized actually is that there isn't a monolith when it comes to Indigenous communities. Not every single Indigenous community member believes that nature is intrinsically valuable and they must protect it against all odds. Many people, like most of us, are driven by economic circumstance and the need to provide for families. So what we've learned is that when you unbundle that idea of the noble savage and when you begin to see people for who they truly are, you realize that for the communities that protect nature, there is this intrinsic love for wildlife and nature, but they also understand that there is so much to gain from protecting the natural world. There is a huge impetus for action because a healthy planet keeps us all safe.
Now, after the interview, I will examine a recent study on the creator economy. You're going to want to stick around for that. I'll explore how Netflix and YouTube are dominating linear TV, of course, and I will discuss the latest behind-the-scenes, off-camera scandal that is hitting Bachelor Nation. But first, Malaika Vaz was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list and won the Best On-Screen Talent Award at the 2024 Wildscreen Awards. She was also named an Earthshot Prize Advocate in 2020. Her production company, Untamed Planet, has produced films about climate change, biodiversity loss, environmental crime, human rights, and community conservation. Her projects have been seen in more than 150 countries for platforms like National Geographic, the BBC, Al Jazeera, Apple TV Plus, and Sky TV. All right, enjoy the interview. Malaika Vaz, welcome to No Script, No Problem.
Good to see you, Steve. Thank you for having me on here.
Yes, I am so excited to talk to you. You have accomplished so much in such a short period of time. I feel like an underachiever. I feel lazy.
Absolutely not, Steve. You've done so much, and I truly am just getting started in so many ways.
Yes. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that you do, some of the passions that you have. You know, you're an explorer. You love adventure sports. You're a host. You're a director and a filmmaker. But let's go back to the beginning. So how did you get started with exploring? What gave you this sense of adventure? What gave you this desire to tell stories?
So I grew up on the west coast of India in a place which had so much biodiversity. My family lived not too far from the ocean, so I'd spend my weekends at the ocean. And when I was about 10 years old, I began to compete in windsurfing professionally. So I was representing my country very soon after in windsurfing and training in the ocean. But as a result of like those long hours at sea, I got to see some incredible things, from dolphins to the occasional whale to amazing turtles out at sea. And I really began to have a deep appreciation for the natural world. That began to lead me down the path of wanting to see what was under the surface of the water. So I began scuba diving, spending more time, doing different kinds of adventures. I started working at a crocodile bank, like a zoo that was doing a lot of cool conservation work with reptiles and amphibians. And very soon I was like, I'm seeing all of these incredible things. And I live in a country with, 1 billion people at that time. And now the number only keeps growing. But there is this obvious disconnect between what we see on television and what I'm seeing in the natural world, where it's not just these beautiful whales and dolphins, but you're seeing the threats that they are encountering as well. So I think the juxtaposition of falling in love with nature and also seeing how our human footprint had such a damaging impact in the natural world, those two forces led me down the path of realizing that I wanted to be a storyteller. And I think I knew very early on that I wanted to be an environmental storyteller and make documentaries specifically. I kind of forgot about it along the way as I went to high school, and then found my way back to it after a gap year and a failed math exam and a whole lot of, being a lost 18-year-old. I found my way back to wildlife filmmaking. And I think ever since that moment, it's been 9, 10 years almost now. It's been the most incredible journey. I've been able to have such an amazing community and team who I've had such an amazing time working on documentaries and projects together with. So yeah, I'm very grateful for the fact that the oceans led me to the career path of my dreams.
That's a good point that you just made right there. You feel like it was the oceans that kind of led you to picking up a camera and starting to tell stories. Was that kind of the genesis that made you go, I want to tell stories? It was the oceans?
Every time I get asked this question, I often have like a different story. I'll be like, it was the time I worked at a zoo. It was the oceans. It was the time I went on this expedition. And I honestly think now that I've synthesized it all, no one makes a career choice based on one moment. It's always an amalgamation of different experiences, perspectives, conversations, and lived moments that influence who you are and what you care about. And I think for me, I'm very lucky in that what I do today for work is 100% a representation of who I am as a person. If I got $1 million every month in my bank account, I would still do exactly what I do, just with a little bit less stress, but I would do exactly that. And I think that, to me, filmmaking is a representation of who I am as a creative. Now with the production company, it's a representation of who I am as an entrepreneur as well. So it really brings together these different worlds that I'm interested in very deeply.
You mentioned your production company, Untamed Planet. So you are the co-founder and the CEO of Untamed Planet. And this is a tremendous venture. You guys are doing some incredible things for the environment and through storytelling, which is a great way to tackle something like climate change. Can you talk a little bit about how Untamed Planet was formed and some of the ways you guys are telling stories through cinematography, kind of documentaries that you guys are doing?
So, Untamed Planet started in 2017. I founded it along with my best friend and co-founder, Nitya Sood. We, had just finished making a documentary. We'd been making a couple of shorter films, but we made our first feature-length documentary about the trade in illegal wildlife across borders. So we followed the trade in marine products from India to Myanmar, across China, and then back, and in Hong Kong as well. And at the end of that process, we realized we needed to put, a logo on this film that we were putting out that was being acquired by TV networks after its festival run. And we said, well, Untamed Planet sounds like a cool title. Let's just like slap that on there. And it was funny because at the moment, the only question was, what are we going to put as, the title on this film? Because we just can't put our names only. But since then, it has morphed into a company. It's morphed into so much more. It is truly a dream to work on projects with my team. We work on a range of different projects that ranges from everything in the natural history space, so animal documentaries. Then we also do investigative films that focus on issues that are environmental and also around human rights. And then we do a lot of stories about the interface between humans and nature on our planet and how that plays out. And we've recently expanded into different spaces as well. We started off doing only animals and then only environmental stuff. But as we've grown as a company, we've taken on, more branded content. We've done a travel show recently with National Geographic Asia. Yeah, we've just, expanded the ambit of what we focused on. And I think through that process, what I've learned is actually, even if you're doing a story about economics or human rights or politics, it all really ties back to the environment. The environment is this thread that you see across every story that we tell today. So I think that through line is still very relevant.
You mentioned National Geographic. You are a National Geographic Explorer. So what does that mean to you? And kind of talk to me a little bit about, what does a National Geographic Explorer do? What is your role with Nat Geo? Obviously, a tremendous brand.
So National Geographic is divided into the society side, which is the nonprofit wing of National Geographic, and then the partners, which, handles the magazine and the channel and so many other for-profit ventures that Nat Geo has.
Being a National Geographic Society Explorer means that you are funded by the society and that you are a part of an amazing global community of explorers across different disciplines, everything from space exploration to ocean technology to science to literature, journalism, every field that you can imagine. And I think that this idea of being an explorer has really expanded, not just since the founding of National Geographic, but even since I've become an explorer. People who are doing amazing humanitarian work, protecting the rights of young women in Afghanistan, for example, they're National Geographic explorers. People who are studying the deepest parts of the ocean, then they're Nat Geo explorers. And journalists who are bridging the gap between different audiences, bringing different ideas together, they're all Nat Geo explorers. So I got a National Geographic Explorer grant when I was about 19 years old. And I'd made a couple of films at that point, but it was the first time where I was working on a project with zero editorial guardrails. National Geographic is incredible in that they give you this funding, but they also give you trust. They say, we believe in you as a person, and we want you to go out there and make, in my case, the film of your dreams. We want you to believe in yourself and work with the team collaboratively and have equity at the core of everything that you do, and just create something that is the highest possible quality. So my first project with National Geographic was a series called Living with Predators, which was initially supposed to be a 3-part digital series, but we got a little bit of additional funding, and it became a TV show about how communities coexist with big cats. After the series was done, it was acquired by Nat Geo across the world and also other TV networks. And I think what was amazing about that was National Geographic acted as kind of like a sandbox for me as a young filmmaker, where I was allowed to like go out there and explore and try out my version of storytelling. And when these TV networks picked up the show, that just opened up so many opportunities for us as a production company as well at that point. So yeah, it's been an amazing community. It's been an amazing support system. And I'm so inspired by not just my peers in Nat Geo, but also the way the National Geographic has evolved over the years. It has confronted some of, its darkest truths as a journalistic platform. It has improved in the way that it represents communities, in the way that it represents people's connection to nature. And it's truly become, I think, a force for good.
So you're telling me you were 20 when you had your first series across the globe for Nat Geo?
Yeah, I was 19 when I began that project. And before that, I'd worked in shorter films. But yeah, I started off doing all of this when I was 18, straight out of high school. I never went to college. I thought initially it was a gap year, but it's like a 10-year long gap year at this point.
It's a gap career.
It's a gap
career. You're still on that gap year. Still going. Yeah. Malaika, when I was 19 and 20, I was in college drinking beer, still figuring out what I was going to do with my life.
Too. I partied wildly in those years as well, besides spending my time with the tigers and the lions. So you've got to do it all.
How were you filming these gigantic predators, these gigantic cats that are dangerous and can eat your face off? Where's that courage in you? Where's that vision and that courage in you to go, okay, I'm going to work with my team. I'm going to get these beautiful shots, but I'm also going to get so close that the audience has never seen anything like that. At age 20 or age 19, you're doing this.
Well, first off, I'm not a cinematographer, so I work with incredibly talented cinematographers and sound recordists and field assistants and drone operators and production managers and producers and executive producers. So it's always a team effort. And more importantly, besides our filmmaking team, we also collaborate with scientists and researchers and forest guards. So even though, at points when I'm directing, or especially when I'm on camera, it might appear like I am right there with the big cat and there's no safety mechanism and I'm the only one right there. There is, of course, an entire crew that is keeping us safe, and we work with the right community members who understand the behavior of these animals. And I think over the years, as I've worked with wildlife, I know how to read animal behavior. So I know when we are, being safe, when we're respecting their boundaries, and I know when we're stepping over that line. And I think it's not just about safety for our crew, it's equally about safety for the animals, because we can be pretty dangerous as a species. So you never want to, risk disturbing an animal when it's hunting, disturbing it when it's with its young ones. So I'm very conscious of making sure that when we work on a documentary film, whether it is with wildlife or with communities, we're very respectful of that space. But then again, I will also say that I love the experience of being up there, right next to a tiger or a lion. I've had the privilege to walk alongside lions while filming. I've had the privilege of filming with tiger sharks and with spending time underwater with blue whales. Having a bear chase me at one point when we were filming in the Himalayas. My colleagues have been chased by rhinos. It's always an adventure. Every single day on field is dramatic and exciting. And some days it's just boring waiting for a lot of time, sitting in a hide or sitting in a jeep, waiting for long days for the animals to do anything. But I think one of the things that I've found through the process of working on documentaries in the natural world is that it's really important to tell the stories of these beautiful wild beings, but equally to tell the stories of how we as humanity interact with them. There are incredible communities who are on the front lines protecting these species. And we get to leave as filmmakers. I get to have that amazing encounter with the lion and then, come back to New York. But we know people who our forest guards who we've gotten to know and become friends with, who spend their entire lives tracking these animals, protecting them against poaching, helping to create peace in the community when there is human wildlife conflict. They're the heroes. So for me as a storyteller, whether I'm presenting or directing, my focus is always on being either the conduit for those stories or really being just the person who shines the light on the real superheroes, who are these community members.
At what point do you start to feel like you need to tell the stories about climate change? Obviously, you're telling wildlife stories, which is certainly connected to climate change, but there's clearly a shift in your projects where you're like, okay, we need to really start telling this side of the story very, very openly and honestly.
I appreciate you noticing that shift over the course of my career. When I first started, I only was focused on telling stories of I'd say hyper local problems, poaching in a specific area. Then it began to be stories that were transnational, like trafficking of species. And then I realized actually that it was so easy to make films about wildlife trafficking, about poaching, about environmental crime, where the real onus of accountability was on small scale criminals. It's easy to go up to someone who makes less than $5,000 a year and say that you're a criminal. I'm going to film undercover and get this, crazy footage and then put that into a film that goes across the world. That's an easy story to tell, I think. After having done that for a while, and I think these are important stories as big criminal syndicates that are destroying our planet, those are important stories to tell, and I continue to tell them. I think I began to notice that we also need to shift our focus as filmmakers and conservationists to telling stories of systems and how there are large interests that are actively benefiting from the destruction of our planet. So, in the last couple of years, a lot of my documentaries have focused on international players, including governments, large corporations, and larger entities, intergovernmental entities that are in many ways facilitating the destruction of our planet. In fact, our most recent documentary with National Geographic that releases next year is called Sacrifice Zone, and it is about the impact of extractive industry on communities of color. So we began to look at the subject of climate change. We realized that there is a handful of industries that have the most outsized impact. And not only do they have the most outsized impact in terms of emissions, but they also are directly impacting the communities who live right next to them. And they're creating these sacrifice zones. When I first heard the word sacrifice zone, I was taken aback. It gave me, a weird feeling in my stomach to think about the fact that we could sacrifice people in 2024. it is messed up. We cannot be thinking about humanity like that. We cannot be thinking about the natural world like that. So we began to look into the impact of fast fashion, plastic, coal, and oil and gas for incredibly large players that actually connected in many ways. And we saw that in every single part of the world that we went to while filming for this documentary, the same story was playing out. Wherever there was vulnerability, large corporate forces were exploiting that and they were benefiting financially from it. But the community, who very often had very little political agency, was not able to protect themselves against the impacts of these industries. So, Sacrifice Zone is a story about the impact of big industry, but I think at a larger meta level, it is a representation of something that my team and I have come to believe, that we need to change our way of thinking about the environment. And that is, we've got to stop putting the onus of accountability on consumers and making you feel guilty for um, your coffee cup, which has like plastic on it, but really think about how big corporations are impacting our planet every single day in really negative ways. I am someone who believes that capitalism can be a force for good. Actually, I don't think that it needs to be completely taken down. I think it needs to be reformed. But I think we need to work with industry. We need to work with the corporate sector. We cannot antagonize them. We cannot push them aside. We've got to work with them and figure out solutions that can protect both public health and our economies.
That's really interesting because anytime you tackle a climate documentary, whether you're Al Gore and Inconvenient Truth or, one of the Leo DiCaprio documentaries, every filmmaker has to come at it with a very specific POV. So how do you differentiate yourself as a environmental filmmaker or a climate change filmmaker, or however you want to, look at yourself when you're going about this? What is your specific POV so that you're not going at it the exact same way that maybe some other filmmaker does?
That's a great question. Well, first off, I don't often call myself an environmental filmmaker or a climate filmmaker. I feel like film is a representation of my curiosity for the world. And today it is the environment, tomorrow it might be something else. But what does stay constant is this intrinsic need that I have within myself to constantly know what the story really is. And that means actively looking for different opinions, meeting people who disagree with me, trying to confront these very difficult, nuanced conversations with empathy. And I do think that, consumers have responsibility, but corporations have much larger responsibility and governments have a much larger responsibility. So while I'm more hesitant to put the onus of accountability on, your plastic toothbrush, I do think we need to start thinking about the nexus between fossil fuel subsidies and campaign contributions. Those are the important conversations. And I think for me, I've always looked at things from a systems level in the last few years, I'd say. And I think that systems thinking really influences who I am as a filmmaker. So the reason, for example, that we chose to tell stories from across the world with this recent project, or even with the productions that we have ongoing right now, we choose a deliberately global approach. We go everywhere from Bangladesh to Louisiana to Colombia to India to Florida. And what we found is that actually there's very similar themes that you see playing out in these different locations. And it's important for people to realize that even though our politics might be different and our economy might be different in many places, we're all united by very similar systemic forces. And I think that systems level thinking, like I was saying, allows us to feel more empathy for people in a different part of the world. It allows us to think more intelligently about issues that affect every single one of us on our planet.
Not every filmmaker likes to see themselves on camera. So you have made a decision to put yourself on camera, and that affects the way the story is told. It affects the point of view. It really kind of adds a unique perspective that a Michael Moore has. Alex Gibney likes to add the voiceover. So what made you decide that that's the type of filmmaker you want to be? And how does that kind of change the style of documentary that you make as opposed to maybe somebody else does?
That's a great question, too. I think, before I got into filmmaking, I worked with a lot of other young people on running this very exciting community initiative that worked to empower female survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And we did that through adventure sports. So, my background for a few years was working in pretty much the nonprofit community empowerment space. And I think through that process, I really learned how to help someone tell their story, how to get people to open up, how to respectfully engage, how to get people to, talk about things that they believe in and really respect their opinion and give them the opportunity to be who they are. And when I began to, make my foray into wildlife and environmental filmmaking initially, that human angle was just right there for me. I had to focus on it, and I didn't initially think that I was going to be a TV presenter. It kind of happened all out of nowhere because we had a presenter for a show, didn't really work out with that person on camera, and I was the assistant on the project. So I stepped into the booth, started filming some behind the scenes, and my producer at the time said it worked out. Since then, I've realized across different shows and films that I've made in the last decade that I really do enjoy being on camera for many reasons. It allows me to connect with people, to have these incredible experiences and kind of synthesize them for audiences in a sense. But more importantly, I think that growing up, I watched a lot of television shows with people from across the world who were on camera. And I didn't see too many people who looked like me. I didn't grow up seeing too many women of color, especially on camera, telling stories about the natural world. And as a young person, I feel like that might have made me feel like I belonged even more to the wild. So when I began telling stories initially as a TV presenter,
It was amazing to have young women from across the world, writing me emails and sending me Instagram messages and reaching out in person sometimes and saying that they felt like that gave them the confidence to go explore the wild a bit more, to start telling their own story. And I think that that journey really made me believe that it is important to have diversity in our storytelling process, not just in terms of, where you're from or what you look like, but even in terms of intellectual diversity. What kinds of opinions are we platforming? What backgrounds do our contributors have on camera? So I've really enjoyed being a TV presenter, but equally, we work in a lot of productions at Untamed Planet where I'm not the only person on camera, or, we have another presenter sometimes. And even in that process, we're looking for people who have a unique perspective.
All right. I do want to ask you about some of the tougher assignments that you've had going undercover, taking on poaching animals, trafficking. Tell me a little bit about maybe the toughest or scariest assignment you've had, maybe some hairy situations you've gotten yourself in. Well, maybe tell me what's been the scariest moment that you've had where you were like thankful just to get out of it.
oh, there's been so many. I actually feel like I thrive on a little bit of adrenaline. Um, I can't imagine life without being, slightly on the edge. But I've received death threats for the films that we've worked on after they've released. We've been followed by police in the Middle East. We had our cameras and our phones confiscated in Doha while telling a story about labor rights recently.
Can you be specific? Which project were you receiving death threats on?
So we were making a film about wildlife trafficking, and we followed these criminal syndicates all the way from India to China. We spent some time with them in Myanmar as well, documenting the way that these wildlife goods and contraband gets transported across borders. When the film came out on television, I received a threat which was really scary. But I mean, even in that moment, my first thought was that I'm so glad that we kept the identities of our, community guides, our, local producers concealed, because again, I do have the privilege of not being in the locations that we're often filming, and I do get to go back home. So even though we've had these incidents where we've gotten death threats, you've had the police coming after us, we've had our cameras confiscated, we've had, shots being deleted, we've had our phones being checked, we've had to make sure that we have, fake business cards and fake identities. And yeah, we've climbed up mountains to avoid militia in parts of the world. It's been intense, I think, in many ways, but through all of these crazy experiences, the one thing that keeps me grounded is remembering why I'm doing this. Yes, those adventures are exciting, but more than anything, I think it's important to pay attention to the why. And very often, the why is we believe that this ecosystem needs to be protected. We believe that this community's story needs to be told. And sometimes the only way to get that access and to get that information is to go undercover. It is to figure out other ways of telling that story. I think in the last few years, there's many stories that I've told where, we've decided that we don't need to go undercover. We can have a conversation and that's okay. But the times that I have gone undercover with, buttonhole cameras and cameras in my glasses and cameras in all sorts of places is when that was the only way to do that. And I have to prepare so much. My team and I spend days, weeks, months, sometimes just getting ready for those assignments because you cannot make a single mistake there. When we were filming in China, we pretended to be a seafood trading company. So one thing that I had to do was learn about the different kinds of species of seafood that were being traded so that I didn't just go into a store and ask for shark fin or manta rays or the big charismatic megafauna. We had to know the smaller fish, because if you don't know the smaller fish, they're going to know that you aren't a real trader. When we were filming in Qatar recently for another documentary, which was about the FIFA World Cup, following the footsteps of this amazing formerly trafficked journalist who was investigating the labor abuses in the Middle East, we had an incident where we had trouble with the authorities. I can't say too much about it because it was tricky and it was dangerous, but those incidents really, they're terrifying. But at the end of the day, we get out of there safe. We keep our people safe. And we tell stories that I think are really close to my heart and my colleagues' hearts.
That's pretty badass. That's that's, that's intense. Okay. All right. I saw that you got your pilot's license at 16.
Yeah, I did. I had a lot of adventures when I was younger. And then I realized that, climbing mountains, flying planes, doing all of these things that I managed to do a lot of times with scholarships and with funding and, all sorts of help from different people across the world. All of those amazing adventures were really cool, but um, they didn't mean much to me without being able to have some impact associated with it. So while adventure is a core part of so many of the stories that we do, I think it has to actually be connected to a real sense of purpose. Otherwise, I don't find it exciting anymore. Like, for example, we were filming recently the story about plastic pollution. And I climbed a landfill in Ghazipur in New Delhi, which was literally like the size of a mini mountain. It was massive and I just kept climbing through it. And at one point I'd like fallen through the landfill and there were like diapers and all sorts of things around me. And we were trying to just represent the scale of what's happening with these landfills and with plastic pollution. And climbing that mountain was a way to draw audiences in. Did I need to do that to tell the story? Possibly there were ways to do it without that. But I do think that it's a way to engage audiences, to get people excited about conservation storytelling. So often we have this hipster disdain for mainstream popular programming, but I think it's really important to lean into mechanisms and strategies to make our environmental stories more impactful. And if that means climbing a mountain, if that means going undercover to tell, show audiences a different side of the story, if that means interviewing climate change deniers in Florida, like I did recently, then we've got to do it, because I think we need to surprise and challenge and excite audiences if we want to get their attention, and have them watch environmental documentaries and not just reality TV.
Hipster disdain. I'm going to steal that. I'm taking that. How would you describe the smell of that landfill?
Oh, God. It was the worst thing ever. I had to throw my clothes out. Like, I'm not even kidding. I thought that washing them 3 times would do the job. I almost threw the the washing machine. No, I'm kidding. But it was so bad. We were reeking of that stuff for days. But also, I think that experience of climbing the landfill showed me a side of our human footprint on the planet that I never imagined. Because very often these places exist and they're in our cities, but they're kind of sealed away, or they're in these sacrifice zones. So as someone with, a relative amount of privilege in the system, I get to insulate myself from these things. But as a storyteller, I really appreciate being able to go out there into the real world, be in the field, and actually bring the stories of these places back to audiences on television and on streamers.
Recently, you were named part of the 30 under 30 for Forbes. How did that make you feel? I mean, it's got to be pretty cool.
Thank you, Steve. Well, I will say that I was surprised and I was very happy when I received that email. But also, it was interesting because I only moved to the United States 3 years back. So to be on the North America list for the 30 under 30 just felt really special. It kind of felt like a hug from the US, because immigrating to a new country is hard. It's been, a rough couple of months in the United States. And I think that, moving your entire life from India, where I came from, to the US wasn't easy. We incorporated in India initially. Half my team's there, half our team is now working out of the US. Then we incorporated here in 2022, and I think many of our clients are the same. But there's so much you have to do to like build a production company in a whole other continent, thousands and thousands of kilometers away from everyone you know. And I think it's been such an amazing adventure. I'm really grateful to the meritocratic structures of America in many ways. I'm grateful to how, this industry has welcomed us. I think it's been hard in parts too, but the Forbes thing was exciting because it just felt like, yeah, like I said, a hug from the US, because it was a North America category.
All right. As someone who has had a lot of success as a young filmmaker, what is your advice to other young folks who are excited to pick up a camera, who feel like they have stories to tell? What advice do you give them?
I would say the sky is truly the limit. Believe in yourselves recklessly. Constantly be your biggest champion, because it's going to be hard. People will tell you that you're too young, that you've, got so much more to learn before you start telling stories. But the truth is, storytelling is now more democratized than it ever has been. We have access to so many platforms to begin telling stories about the things that we care about. So just get started. And I think, the journey will unfold. You'll find the right collaborators and connections and funding along the way. The other thing I would say to young filmmakers hoping to start out is, for the first couple of projects, choose topics that you really, truly care about. Don't worry about what the zeitgeist is. Don't think about, what your favorite filmmaker is working on. Think about what you'd be happy to work on for 7 years. It might not be 7 years. It might be 2 years. It might be 6 months. But just think about what it is that you're truly willing to pour yourself into, because I think those first few projects are so important. They're seminal. They set up the pace for who you are as a creative, as a storyteller. So invest in ideas that make you as excited about Monday mornings as they do about Friday nights.
And what are you excited about filming right now? Obviously, from a wildlife perspective, from a conservation standpoint, from a climate change perspective, there's a lot for you to dig into. What are you excited about?
Well, I think as a production company co-owner, one thing I'm really excited about is that when we first started, I feel like the films that we worked on were a representation of who my co-founder and I are. We were working on things that were close to our heart. As our team has grown, I think it's been so amazing to work with people who are way more talented, way smarter, way better at what we do than I am. And the films we work on are now a representation of everyone's ideals and beliefs and passions. So I think growing the company has been exciting. I love working with everyone at Untamed Planet, and I'm excited to keep growing together. We have a range of different projects, but the ones that I'm working on most closely
in 2025 are a lot of solutions-oriented stories. So that for me is a big shift, because I've told some, like we've talked about, some dark stories over my career. We've been to dark places and brought that to audiences. But I think I'm at this point in my life and in my career where I've seen the impact we have on the environment, and I want to be able to bring the stories of the solutions that exist outside to TV. outside of my work as a filmmaker, I do some consulting work, and I serve as an advisor and on the boards of a few nonprofits. And I think that experience has really shown me how much it matters right now to invest in the right technologies, in the right innovations to help us really supercharge this green transition. So I want to bring those different worlds together, and as a filmmaker, focus on lots of optimistic, solutions-oriented, action-inspiring programming in the next couple of years. And I think if I had to zoom out to 10 years or 20 years, what we're trying to do here is to make the environment mainstream. We want to take environmental stories and bring them to the largest possible audiences. Unless we have them on primetime television, on every school book, in every politician's speech, if the environment isn't front and center in our conversations as a community, as a global community, we're not going to be able to protect nature. So for me, as a storyteller and as a filmmaker, I think my responsibility is really to help supercharge that mainstreaming.
I'm glad you brought up technology, because that leads me to my final question.
Yeah.
AI. How do you feel AI fits into your style of filmmaking, which is very raw? You're out in the wilderness, you're out in the middle of nowhere, you're climbing up landfills. A lot of people are adjusting to a brand new world of ChatGPT and Gemini and Runway and Sora. How do you see AI fitting into what you're trying to do?
I've been thinking about this a lot in the last year. I do think that with nonfiction storytelling, artificial intelligence can actually help us to streamline a lot of our internal processes. It can help us to take away a lot of the grunge work from filmmaking, like transcribing and logging and all of that stuff. But I think that given that the very allure of nonfiction storytelling is the voice of storytellers and the communities that they meet with and the people that they interview, I think it will always be relevant. I don't think that, technology has the ability to completely take away our human need for connection through video. I think that we will always want to hear the perspective of someone who has loved and lost and experienced the world and been human. And so I think that I don't worry about having a job in 2065. I think that I still will have a job, and our colleagues will still continue to be doing work that means something and is valuable. I think it's a delicate balance between using this to streamline our processes and help us to make better films, and really holding on to what is human right now.
I think that's a great answer. It's a great perspective. Malaika Vaz, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this, and I cannot wait to see what you do next.
Thank you so much, Steve. It was a pleasure speaking with you today.
All right, it's time for your reality check. First up, streaming is on the verge of eclipsing linear TV. No shocker. But this is happening much faster than we thought, and I apologize if this is making your head spin or you're rolling your eyes as you listen to this. Streaming accounted for 43% of all TV viewing in January, a jump of almost 7 points from just a year ago. YouTube, Netflix, and Amazon continue to increase their lead over the rest of the competition. YouTube added about 2% to its share over the last year, while Disney is basically flat over 3 years. With this in mind, ESPN and Major League Baseball are splitting up.
MLB Commissioner Rob Manfred told team owners this week that both parties have agreed to let the current contract expire at the end of the upcoming 2025 season. Manfred said the MLB was not open to ESPN's request for a reduction in rights fees. He also pointed to what he said was inadequate coverage of baseball outside of live game broadcasts on ESPN. The league says it hopes the split will allow it to regain control of local broadcast rights and pursue streaming and other broadcast options across other platforms.
ESPN had been paying an average of $550 million a year for 30 regular season games, the Home Run Derby, the Wild Card Playoff Round, and up to 10 spring training games. The cost of live sports has soared and the pay TV business has shrunk. It's only a matter of time for ESPN to cut bait on some of these sports. On the flip side, according to CNBC, ESPN wants to do? User-generated content. That's right, they're looking for content creators. So much of sports now is consumed in highlights via YouTube, X, Threads, TikTok, or Instagram. Places like House of Highlights or Overtime or various creators post highlights moments after they occur, not to mention ESPN's own digital team. It's all pretty much happening as you watch the game, so why even bother watching the entire game with all the commercials when you can just basically be on Instagram or X or Threads and catch the highlights as they come along while you're doing something else. Check out this exchange on CNBC where they're talking about this potential move by ESPN and what it could mean for the so-called worldwide leader in sports.
ESPN's trying to figure out how can we court young viewers, particularly Gen Alpha. They're already thinking about them, even though the Gen Alpha people aren't going to be the ones paying the $25 or $30. Gen Alpha is born between 2010 and 2025. So we're talking about 0 to 15-year-olds. And the problem is these kids don't watch live sports. And the entire ESPN business is predicated on live sports. So one of two things is going to happen. They're either going to age into watching live sports, and that's more or less the status quo. And I think the leagues and ESPN hope that gambling entices these kids to watch live sports as they turn 18 and older.
An entire generation.
That's right. That is going to be hooked up on gambling. Look, this is the world we're headed to, Joe. The second one, I think, is ESPN's trying to figure out maybe we need to be a little bit more creative about how we bring in younger people, and the leagues are on board with this. And what I'm reporting today is that it may not happen exactly at launch, but ESPN is already thinking about user-generated content to build into this new streaming app. So that's a new frontier for ESPN. It's largely lived on YouTube, but all of these traditional streamers now, Disney writ large, is thinking about how do we incorporate user-generated content because we see it's so popular with this generation of kids on YouTube. Is there a way of bringing influencers in? Maybe we can create software around our program that allows parents to build something and they can share something with their kids from a UCG standpoint. So I think the details are still a little hazy here, but they're certainly thinking about the concepts, and I think things are in the works to bring this as a part of this new streaming app. There was a phenomenal statistic that, of course, YouTube promoted it. I don't remember the exact percentage, but it was like more than half of like Gen Z, so that's one generation above Gen Alpha, of the people surveyed would rather watch their favorite creator / influencer talk about a live event than watch the live event itself. So that expands beyond sports into things like the Oscars and so forth. But again, this is the world we're living in here.
And speaking of content creators and influencers, Patreon released a fascinating State of Create last week about the current and future state of the creator economy. And for anyone who is even remotely connected to this world, it's definitely worth checking out. I'll link to it in the show notes. Some key findings from the State of Create study include 57% of people's time on TikTok is spent watching content from creators they don't follow or don't even know. More than half of creators surveyed said it's harder to reach fans than ever before, but nearly 60% of creators say that connection is more important than ever. Nearly 80% of creators say that the algorithm impacts what they create. 56% of creators said that the algorithm prevents them from creating what they want. Less than 25% of fans on Instagram spend time in their following feed versus relying on the algorithmic feed. This is less than YouTube's 32% and TikTok's 38%. Now beware of this last statistic because remember, this report comes from Patreon. There is an increase of 67% in creators who report earnings from subscriptions and memberships compared to 5 years ago. This obviously includes platforms like Patreon and Substack. Now, if you spend any time on these various apps and platforms, you've noticed significant changes in your engagement, some of the things mentioned in here. More on this in future episodes. Okay, moving on. Let's talk movies really quickly. Sean Baker took home Best Director at this past weekend's Independent Spirit Awards for his breakout hit film, Anora, which just might win the Oscar for Best Picture on March 2nd. Now, I don't think it was a huge surprise that Sean won the award, but it was his rousing speech that has people in the industry talking.
Indie film is struggling right now more than ever
Gone are the days of DVD sales that allowed for greater risk to be taken on challenging films. That revenue stream is gone, and the only way to see significant back end is to have a box office hit with profits that far exceed what any of our films will ever see, unless you are Damien Leone and strike gold with a franchise like Terrifier. But as we all know, that's an extreme rarity. For me, and I think for many of my peers, if we're lucky, the average number of years dedicated to making a film is around 3. I'm going to say 3. I think most of us have worked a lot longer on our films, but let's go with 3. If you are a writer-director trying to break in right now, there's a good chance you're making a film for free or making next to nothing on production or sale. How do you support yourself with little or no income for 3 years? Let's say you're lucky enough to be with the guilds. Take the DGA and WGA minimums and then divide them by 3. Take out taxes and possibly percentages that you owe your agents, managers, and lawyers. And what are you left with? It's just simply not enough to get by on in today's world. Especially if one is trying to support a family. I personally do not have children, but I know for a fact that if I did, I would not be able to make the movies that I make. Why am I talking about this today? Because I'm an indie film lifer. And I know that there are other indie film lifers in this room. Those who don't see indie films as calling cards. Those who don't make these films to land a series or a studio film. Some of us want to make personal films that are intended for theatrical release with subject matter that would never be greenlit by the big studios.
I really love this sentiment, and I hope studios and financiers are listening. Sticking with movies, Captain America: Brave New World is the #1 movie in the world. But I've got some issues with it, and a note for anybody who hasn't seen the film but is planning to. Before going to see Brave New World, I watched The Falcon and the Winter Soldier on Disney Plus because I thought that's all I needed to know before I watched this movie. Well, no, that is not all that I needed to know. I had no idea that Brave New World would feel like a sequel to 2008's The Incredible Hulk, which not only did I never see, but I didn't even know was a relevant film in the MCU. I was pretty bewildered in the theater during Brave New World, and I now know that the plot has far more to do with the characters from The Incredible Hulk, the 2008 film, which I should have watched, than this new Captain America storyline starring Anthony Mackie as Cap. Also, they kept mentioning this huge statue in the ocean, which again, I was super confused. What the hell are they talking about? And that apparently comes from this other kind of random Marvel movie that came out in 2021 called The Eternals. And I also didn't see that movie. So I'm asking Marvel from now on, please give us a previously on before the movie starts, or give us all a heads up in some sort of press release, these are the films and TV shows you have to watch in order for you to understand this film. Okay, enough bitching. What I am celebrating and what I do want everybody to start watching is all these great TV shows that are on right now. Of course, I am talking about Severance, White Lotus, Yellow Jackets, and Reacher. They are all back and they are as good as ever. I gotta know from my Severance fans out there, what in the hell is Cold Harbor? If you know, email me, noscriptnoproblempodcast@gmail.com. Who is gonna get murdered in White Lotus? I have got to know. And are the girls in Yellow Jackets losing their minds in the wilderness, or are they really experiencing something supernatural? Shoot me an email. Let me know what you think. Oh, and I almost forgot. The best new show out there right now is Paradise on Hulu. You got to check this one out if you haven't seen it yet. Sterling K. Brown is at his best. It's got all these mysterious qualities. It's kind of like Lost and Silo. All right, finally, in Water is Wet news, Deadline reports that many crew members of the long-running reality dating series The Bachelor have accused new Bachelor showrunners Claire Freeland and Bennett Graebner of fostering a, quote, hostile and, quote, toxic work environment. Sources tell Deadline that Freeland and Graebner have both run the franchise with, quote, fear, including instances of verbal and mental abuse. As someone who worked in reality television for 15 years, I experienced plenty of that. But I'm in no place to judge what these folks are going through. Anyway, The Bachelor has long been notorious and had a reputation for this type of atmosphere. Unfortunately, it seems like now it's as bad as ever. One crew member, according to Deadline, said, quote, "It's a dumpster fire right now," end quote. And as for Bachelor Nation fans, it may irk you to know that The Bachelorette is on hiatus and will skip its typical summer cycle for the first time in almost 20 years. That's right, on February 12th, 5 days after it was announced that The Bachelorette would be pushed, staff who were assigned to work on the series were brought in and told they would not be returning to the franchise. That leaves roughly 200 people, many of whom I know, in the lurch. This is especially bad at this moment where jobs are scarce in television. All right, that's going to do it for another episode of No Script, No Problem on Believe. Please remember, take a look at the show notes if you have the ability to donate to any of the GoFundMes to help folks who have been affected by the LA fires. Please do so. If you enjoy the show, please subscribe, download, and rate it with 5 stars. It's available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Podcast, Stitcher, and TuneIn. You can also find it at Believe.com and at Believe Podcast. Follow me on Blue Sky, Instagram, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Threads, or Facebook. You can also send any questions you have to No Script, No Problem podcast at gmail.com. If you're interested in advertising on the show, please contact Believe at Believe.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Steve Berkowitz for No Script, No Problem.